This short video will review how we can go about determining if a conflict system is primarily destructive or dysfunctional, or constructive or functional. Conflict isn't inherently good or bad. It's just something that happens as we go about trying to live our lives and fulfill our goals in a diverse world of complex relationships, limited resources, and often unjust systems. Conflicts can generally be either destructive or constructive, often showing characteristics of both of these categories. Generally, destructive conflict results in suboptimal outcomes. That is, the conflict is resolved in a less than ideal way, even though there are other more creative and mutually satisfactory solutions that are possible. Destructive conflict also often harms relationships and is very stressful to the people involved. In contrast, constructive conflict results in the best possible outcome for the given circumstances. This doesn't mean that things end up perfectly, but rather that the outcome is as good as it could have been given the limitations of the situation. Constructive conflict also often serves to strengthen relationships, to build trust, and to help people learn about themselves and each other. At the very least, constructive conflict doesn't harm relationships or people. We've talked before about how conflict is a system characterized by feedback loops. This is why we often talk about conflict as a growing spiral. As the parties interact, their behaviors and perceptions are reinforced. A destructive conflict spiral often starts off with some kind of a conflict issue, which then leads to frustration. This is perfectly normal. What makes a conflict destructive is if the actions taken by the parties are harmful in some way. Harmful actions are often met with reactions, which create cycles of revenge. This results in changed attitudes and relationships. As these feedback loops reinforce each other, the conflict may spiral out of control, taking on a life of its own. In these situations, you may actually have a meta-conflict, or in some cases you might use the term intractable conflict. In these situations, the parties are more concerned about addressing how they are being treated, rather than addressing the issue that actually started the conflict in the first place. Constructive conflict cycles actually start off the same way, with an issue and frustration. However, the actions of the parties are less harmful, resulting in improved communication, creativity, improved attitudes and relationships, and ideally, new goals and solutions that satisfy everyone. As with destructive conflict, these cycles of creativity and dialogue serve as reinforcing feedback loops, creating a constructive conflict spiral. As conflict workers, our job is to try to make sure conflicts start off in a way that is constructive. As well, we try to work with destructive conflict, to try to find ways of intervening that will shape the way the conflict system operates. Again, we try to sort of intersect ourselves to change the way that the parties are relating to each other, to introduce alternative ways of looking at things, doing things, and to shape attitudes and relationships, to shift from revenge to other sort of forms of action, to move from frustration to satisfaction and ideally hope, and eventually to develop more constructive conflict spirals. In order to figure out how we can go about changing a conflict system, we need to get a better sense of what exactly is making the conflict destructive. To do this, we can draw upon some specific criteria. I have written information on these different criteria on Nexus and am providing a handout, so I'll just go over it quickly here. Generally, we can distinguish between the criteria for constructive conflict, or functional conflict, and destructive conflict, or dysfunctional conflict. We can decide if a conflict is characterized by integration or polarization. These two categories have to do with how the parties perceive each other. If the conflict is characterized by integration, then there's sort of a recognition of mutual concern and mutual validity. Each party will see the other party's goals as potentially valid. If conflict is very polarized, though, the parties will have a very strong us versus them sort of way of looking at things. The second main category is cooperation versus opposition. This has to do with how the parties frame the conflict overall. A cooperative approach takes kind of a problem-solving approach that sees a possibility for collaborative action. An opposition approach sees the conflict in a very sort of strict win-lose competitive framework. The terms confirmation and disconfirmation refer to the nature of the communication patterns between the parties. A conflict characterized by confirming communication would involve communication actions that recognize the value and worth of the other party. Destructive, disconfirming communication patterns suggest that the party doesn't actually respect or value, or in some cases even recognize, the other party they're in conflict with. The terms power with and power over, or coercion, these has to do with the way that power operates within the conflict, the nature of the power relationships, and how the parties are using power in the conflict. Power with would imply that the parties are seeking to work collaboratively again, and there's sort of a sense of shared power. In power over situations, there's heavy reliance upon coercion, on punishments and rewards, and in assuming positions of superiority over one party over the other. The terms de-escalation and intensification and escalation and suppression all have to do with the general sort of processes within the conflict and the extent to which behaviors and perceptions and emotions are kind of rising and falling over time. De-escalation refers to decreasing levels of negative emotions, of negative behaviors, and negative attitudes. Escalation obviously means an intensification of these things. Parties feel more negative emotions, treat each other in more harmful ways, and have sort of more reified and negative perceptions of each other. Now, the terms intensification and suppression, they mean something a little bit different. When we're talking about intensification, we're talking about sort of this process of bringing issues out into the open so that they can be dealt with in a constructive way. Suppression means to actually suppress the conflict, to push it back under the surface, to prevent people from bringing up issues, avoiding the conflict. So, again, ideally, within a constructive conflict, you're looking to de-escalate negative behaviors, emotions, and attitudes, while at the same time very carefully intensifying certain aspects of the conflict, bringing certain aspects of the conflict out into the open. In a destructive conflict, you'll have either a suppression of particular emotion of aspects of the conflict, kind of combined with an escalation in negative attitudes, behaviors, and emotions. The terms focusing and stepping back and drifting and spiraling, these kind of have to do with the issues that are being explored in a conflict situation. When you're dealing with a conflict constructively, sometimes you really need to just focus in on the issue at hand, to focus on a very specific conflict episode. But also sometimes you need to step back and think about kind of the relationship overall. So again, within constructive conflict processes, we kind of go back and forth, focusing in on a specific conflict issue, a very particular episode, kind of ignoring or temporarily leaving out other aspects of the relationship, but then at other times kind of stepping back and looking more generally at what's going on. So it's kind of this back and forth. Within a destructive conflict, there's a tendency for issue drift, for things that have nothing to do with the immediate conflict episode to be kind of brought in, often used as a mechanism for harming the other party, for, punishing the other party, or reminding the other party of things that they've done wrong in the past. This drifting kind of also leads to increased spiraling and more escalation. So again, in constructive conflict work, we go through this focusing and stepping back in a very careful, kind of conscious way. In destructive conflict, it's not done in a very conscious way. It's more of a haphazard process where people will often bring up sort of negative things from the past just for the sake of using it as a mechanism for control or to try to harm the other party. Lastly, the terms foresight and longsight and short-sightedness have to do with kind of the temporal dimension, the time dimension related to the conflict, particularly how far into the future the conflict parties are thinking. Ideally, within constructive conflict work, you're thinking about kind of the immediate issues and immediate consequences, as well as what's going to happen kind of down the road, kind of further into the future. And you're also thinking about other parties, other people, other issues, other things that might be impacted by the way that the conflict is dealt with in the long term. Short-sightedness is characterized by a tendency to not think about those things, to be very concerned with either winning the conflict or avoiding the conflict kind of in the moment. And this obviously suppresses the conflict, which can lead to more issues further down the line. So that's the main list of criteria. Again, integration and polarization have to do with the way that the parties see each other. Cooperation and opposition have to do with the way that the parties are framing the conflict overall as sort of a cooperative thing or a win-lose framework. Confirmation and disconfirmation has to do with the communication patterns and the communication climate that characterizes the conflict and the relationship between the parties. Power with and power over has to do with the way that parties are trying to use their power and the nature of the power relationships between them. De-escalation and intensification and escalation and suppression has to do kind of with the processes of rising and decreasing tensions, bringing issues out into the open, kind of the overall processes involved in the conflict. Focusing, stepping back, and drifting and spiraling have to do with how focused or how broadly what issues are being brought into the conflict situation. And again, with this idea of, are we doing it very consciously, focusing on specific things and broadening it out, or are we kind of not in control over the way that the issues are being addressed in the conflict? And lastly, foresight and longsight and short-sightedness have to do with how far into the future the parties are thinking when they're going to actually address this conflict. To help you evaluate a conflict system, to figure out if it's largely constructive, functional, or destructive, dysfunctional, I posted a tool on Nexus. I'm calling it a polarity analysis. Why am I calling that? Well, because you have to kind of figure out where a conflict sits on the continuum between functional and dysfunctional, or between destructive and constructive. To use this tool, think about the conflict and assess it based upon each of the main criteria. So you would literally go through and just put an X depending upon where you think the conflict fits. If you think a conflict is characterized by more integration than polarization, maybe you put the X about there. If you think the conflict is a little more cooperative than, a little more than based upon opposition, you could put your X there. If you think the communication is largely very based upon confirming each other, then you might put it there, and so on. You kind of go back and forth evaluating each specific criteria. Then you can kind of look at the conflict overall to consider to what extent you might place it on the continuum. Looking at where I've got all the X's placed here, I would probably stick it kind of sort of where that X is at the bottom. Kind of not completely functional, but kind of further along towards the functional side of the last sort of continuum. Similarly, maybe you've got a conflict which is overall more dysfunctional. Maybe this is kind of the spread that I have of the X's out here. It's more polarized. It's more characterized by a win-lose framework. The communication is largely disconfirming. There's more coercion and escalation and drifting and short-sightedness, etc. And so overall, I would probably say this is overall a far more dysfunctional conflict. Again, these are somewhat subjective assessments, kind of based upon your own perception, your own mental model of the conflict. But the idea is to kind of give you a hint in terms of, where the conflict sits overall, and maybe to sort of identify, what are the sort of the main issues that you could kind of work with or change in order to make the conflict more constructive. To help you out, I do have this particular handout also posted on Nexus that kind of gives you a general overview of the different categories.